I used to believe love was a kind of currency that always gained value when you spent it. The more you gave, the richer you felt. That belief kept me afloat for years, through double shifts, coupon-stacked groceries, and a 30-year mortgage I attacked like a stubborn stain, until one evening it cracked, cleanly and irreversibly, with the sound of people I fed laughing at my expense. It was a Thursday, the kind of evening suburban calendars turn into little trophies. Candles glowed. A playlist hummed from a smart speaker perched on the kitchen counter I'd picked out on a Labor Day sale. The house, my house, wore its best version of itself. Polished wood, fresh flowers, a roast chicken that had been perfuming the air since mid-morning. I had rubbed butter under the skin and tucked rosemary into the cavity, while the sun was still low over the cul-de-sac. I set out a bowl of lemon halves and sea salt like I'd seen on a cooking show I never admitted I watched. The table was staged, napkin rings aligned like wedding bands. I wasn't supposed to be there. Not officially. Olivia had forgotten to mention her parents were coming through town again. Somehow, the text never sent, the call never connected, the reminder never popped up. It happened often enough to feel accidental, only in the way rain accidentally falls in April. But I was there anyway, in the corner of my own kitchen, tidying what was already tidy because I didn't yet know how to leave a room I paid for without asking permission. Her mother arrived wearing the kind of soft cashmere that sheds superiority. Her father carried a bottle of wine like a prop. Their compliments spread across the house in practiced arcs. Lovely space, what a warm home, so tasteful. It would have been almost funny if their praise had landed anywhere near the person who poured herself into every inch of it. But praise, in certain houses, is like a drone. It hovers where it's told. We gathered around the table. I hovered near the sideboard, topping off water, sliding a basket of rolls into reach. I had learned to move in ways that didn't cause friction. Olivia had a talent for making my presence feel like a smudge on an otherwise perfect photograph. "And you are?" her mother asked, eyelids lifted just enough to signal curiosity without ceding position. She didn't ask it cruelly. Cruelty would have been easier to confront. She asked like a woman checking the origin of a table arrangement. "Who sent this? Does it belong?" Olivia didn't pause long enough to leave room for me. She laughed first. Big, performative, the kind of laugh you can aim at a camera. "That's Margaret," she said, tossing my name like a dish towel. "Our unofficial maid. Keeps the house running." It was the way she said our, like my life and my walls had been jointly acquired, like my credit score was a family heirloom they'd polished. The table rippled with polite laughter. Even my son laughed, Ethan, who had cut his first tooth on the leg of that dining chair and scuffed the floor with his soccer cleats I pretended not to notice. He laughed like he'd been waiting for this joke all night. I set the wine bottle on the counter and pretended the tile beneath my feet hadn't tilted. I smiled the way you smile when a doctor says you're going to feel just a little pressure. A smile designed to keep everyone comfortable while your body translates pain. "Excuse me," I said, as if I'd accidentally wandered into the wrong home. I walked down the hall past the family photos. Frames I'd bought at a clearance sale, pictures I'd printed when Walgreens had a buy one get one. There was Ethan in his graduation cap, chin lifted as if he'd manufactured his own sky. There was a picture of Olivia and me from a summer barbecue, her head tipped toward mine, both of us pretending our proximity was warmth. I touched the door to my bedroom, painted by my own hands one weekend, the color of lake water when the sun dives behind clouds. The knob was cool, my legs were steady. I waited there, letting their laughter thin into background noise until it became just another appliance, something that hummed without fixing anything. I didn't sleep, not because I was suffering theatrically, but because clarity took up all the oxygen. There's a particular quiet that isn't mercy, it's assessment. In that quiet, I watched my life spool back. The first day I toured the house with a real estate agent who called me ma'am in a voice that made me feel capable. The mountain of paperwork where my name repeated like a drumbeat. Margaret Walker signing for the roof that would turn storms into lullabies. the long years that followed, where every dollar showed me what it could do if I gave it a home to work for. The little ways I taught myself to make scarcity look like choice. The part-time jobs that were whole-time exhaustion. Cleaning motel rooms where I learned that strangers' messes don't stink less just because you're being paid. Checking groceries at dawn, smiling for coupons and sour moods. Then the inheritance from my parents. Modest, a kindness wrapped in grief. I stacked it all together and built what I called a life. Ethan had come up through the center of it all. Spoon by spoon, inch by inch. I didn't ask him to pay rent when he graduated because I remembered the particular weight of being 22. And watching the world stand across the street, hands in pockets, daring you to cross. Olivia had drifted into his orbit like a balloon tied to nothing, and convinced him she was a compass. By morning I had stopped looking backward. I brewed coffee because muscle memory is stronger than outrage. I fed the cat because she didn't pick a side, only a lap. Then I stood in the kitchen and waited for the person who had renamed me. Olivia came downstairs in a brand new yoga set that tried too hard not to be an outfit. Her thumbs were busy. She looked up only because the human brain feels it when another person's attention lands. "What's this?" she asked when I held out the keys. The jangle felt louder than the night's laughter. "The front door," I said. "Back door, garage, mailbox, spare." Her brow pinched, an expression she used when the world forgot to cooperate. "What are you talking about?" I didn't raise my voice. Rage is loud partly because it knows it has a short shelf life. Clarity doesn't need volume. Good luck with the mortgage. I left before she could recover. I took nothing but my purse and the old wool coat I'd worn when I brought Ethan home from the hospital. The coat still smelled faintly like winter and borrowed courage. I didn't pack a suitcase. I didn't perform grief so anyone could witness it. Ethan called my name as I reached the driveway. I didn't turn, not because I wanted him to feel small, but because I had finally located the door inside my body that said enough, and it had swung open. I slid into the driver's seat, closed the door gently, there's a kind of power in not slamming, and eased away from the curb. People imagine awakening as thunder or fireworks. Mine sounded like tires humming on a familiar road. While I didn't look in the rearview mirror, it felt like discovering my lungs had been negotiating with the air for years, and suddenly the terms improved. The apartment wasn't freedom. Not yet. It was a pause in a city where pauses are expensive. It was a second-floor walk-up in a part of town where older porches tilt toward the sidewalk like tired listeners. The radiators sighed as if they had been asked the same question too many winters in a row. The wallpaper had yellowed in a way that told the truth about time instead of pretending it hadn't passed. Aunt Ruth's name was still on the mailbox downstairs. The landlord hadn't bothered to scrape it off. The place smelled like dust and lemon oil, and every Thanksgiving I'd ever tried to make meaningful. I set my purse on the kitchen table and stood there, hands flat, the way a person might approach a lie detector. I waited to cry because that's what the movies taught me women do when the scene fades to a new set. Tears didn't come. Maybe they were busy elsewhere, washing out some corner of me where I couldn't see. The first week I moved like a guest. I slept on the couch because the bed frame leaned left as if it had been arguing with gravity for years and finally lost. I ate peanut butter sandwiches and microwaved soup, and pretended they were delicacies specially prepared for someone who was learning how to go easy on herself. I didn't call anyone. Not because I had no one, but because I recognized the quiet as triage. You have to stabilize a life before you invite voices into the room. Ethan didn't text. Olivia didn't either. The silence from their end felt less like punishment and more like proof. For so long I had thought of invisibility as something you suffer. It turns out sometimes it's a choice. Step to the side, let the scene play without you, and see what stays standing. At night, when the radiator ticked to settle, I wrote. I found 3 old spiral notebooks in a box marked Aunt Ruth. Misk. They still smelled like junior high hallways and pencil shavings. I filled them, not with Dear Diary or How Dare They, but with specific weight, How many times I reheated dinner after the running late text. How I held my breath when the front door opened and the conversation skipped over me like a scratched record. How I made a game out of guessing which parts of me would pass inspection today. My hair, my mood, my usefulness. I wrote in the margins too, because the story of my days had always been told between lines. I wish I could tell you I slept the night after I left, or the next, or the next. I didn't. I was busy deleting a version of myself that had been syncing across devices for years. It takes time to clear that kind of cache. But by the end of the second week, I could fall asleep to the sound of a city bus braking outside and wake to the small astonishment of my own schedule. That alone felt like wealth, choosing when to make coffee, which brand of quiet to drink with it, where to set the cup. People talk about breaking points as if they arrive like cavalry. Mine came as a sentence, casually delivered between a salad course and a story about a beach house I would never be invited to. But the real breaking happened later, in ordinary light, when I handed over keys and refused to explain myself. That was the moment the currency of my life changed. Love would no longer be spent to prove I had it. It would be saved and then invested with the kind of attention that pays dividends, to the woman who made a home from a salary that didn't believe she could, to the mother who taught a boy to aim his life at better weather, to the person standing alone in a second-floor kitchen repeating a new fact until it sounded normal. I am not a prop. I didn't know what came next. I only knew this, whatever it was, it would not require me to audition for the role of myself. The apartment had one closet that wasn't really a closet. More of a narrow attic crawlspace reachable by a stubborn pull-down ladder. The cord hung like a frayed tail above the hallway. On the fourth morning, after my coffee cooled into resolve, I tugged it down and climbed. The air up there was the temperature of old paper. Dust floated in shafts of light that pushed through a cracked vent. Boxes were stacked in a geometry that could have been accidental or wise. Aunt Ruth never did anything halfway. She had been a nurse for decades at St. Mary's, the local hospital with the brick facade, and the statue that tried, and failed, to make grief noble. She'd worked nights mostly, the kind of shifts that teach you which machines beat before a storm, and which hallways collect a certain kind of silence. Ruth was the aunt who knew which casseroles heal. When my parents died within 15 months of each other, she didn't say everything happens for a reason. She showed up with a check that smelled like mothballs and mercy. When I signed the deed to the house, she was there with a pen and a look that said, "You were always going to do this, weren't you?" The apartment had been hers in the 70s, then rented to grad students who left behind textbooks and grudges, and finally held as just in case. I never expected just in case would be me. I found the metal trunk in the back, tucked under a blanket like a dog that liked to sleep under tables. It was heavier than memory should be. The latch resisted, and then gave with a sound like an old verdict. Inside lay neat stacks, manila envelopes labeled in Ruth's careful print, a tin of buttons shaped like strawberries, a Polaroid of someone I couldn't place, a rosary, surprisingly weighty, a cluster of paperclips that had rusted together into something almost sculptural. I lifted the top envelope. "Margaret," it said, and under that, smaller, "If you ever need to hear the truth from someone who loved you." There are sentences that come into a room and steady the furniture. I sat cross-legged on the floor, the wood pressing crescents into my skin through my jeans, and opened the envelope. Ruth's letter was dated 29 years ago. The first paragraph was all apology, the kind that doesn't demand forgiveness, only asks for the right to keep going. By the second paragraph, the nurse in her had taken over, short lines, precise nouns, careful timestamps. She wrote about a strange night at St. Mary's, the night Ethan was born. A last-minute room switch, a staffing mix-up. 2 babies carried to the nursery under fluorescent light, their tags handwritten because the label printer had jammed. She wrote about a moment when she felt something in her chest go cold, like a door had opened where no door should be. She told a supervisor. By morning, files were corrected. Everyone wanted the story to land on the softest surface. It didn't. I couldn't prove anything, she wrote. I had no authority. I had only a feeling and a set of notes that didn't match the tidy story. Over the years, I've kept my eyes open. Paper has a way of confessing. The rest of the envelope contained what paper had confessed. Copies of intake forms, a summary of a small settlement paid by the hospital to a family named Jameson for postnatal distress related to temporary nursery confusion, a photocopy of a grainy photograph of a newborn with a name typed under it, Michael Jameson. A later document, clearly obtained in a way that would make an administrator uneasy, showed a discrepancy corrected in an internal audit that never reached a courtroom. And then, tucked at the back, the boldness of a DNA summary, dated years after the fact, genetic markers suggesting Ethan and I were not biologically related. I read it once through and didn't react. Then I read it again and felt my body do what bodies do when truth enters. It recalibrated its distance to the ground. On the third reading, I began to breathe like the air was brand new. If you're waiting for rage, I understand. I thought it would arrive, too. But what came was quieter, and, in its way, more devastating to the life I'd sustained, relief. Not relief from love. I didn't feel a single ounce less of the love I had poured into Ethan's childhood like a steady stream, but relief from confusion. That ache I had spent years insulating with busyness and usefulness and don't make a fuss, suddenly had a map. The sense that I lived just outside my own home even while paying every bill. The way Ethan's gratitude landed like something he'd been told to send. The coldness that had crept into our rooms not as weather but as policy. Maybe I hadn't imagined it. Maybe the distance between us had been real, introduced at birth, widened by choices that came later. What do you do with a truth that revises not only your past, but your identity? I didn't know. So I did what my hands knew. I turned the pages back into a stack. I slid them into a new envelope as if I were rewrapping a fragile gift. I labeled it with today's date and placed it carefully in the nightstand I'd dragged in from the hallway like a busted little ship. Then I lay back on the couch and let the ceiling crackle its ancient language while I practiced a sentence I could barely say in my head. Ethan is not my biological son. The sentence didn't erase a single soccer practice, homework session, or fever I'd sat beside. Love doesn't dissolve under lab light, but it did rearrange the furniture of my mind. Suddenly there was room for a new piece of information somewhere in this town, or at least within the radius of our lives, was a man my age's son should be calling Mom. A man who had been raised by people who weren't expecting him, and yet did it anyway. A man with his own history, his own parents, his own childhood that had nothing to do with me, and everything to do with something that happened under the fluorescent hum of St. Mary's, nearly 3 decades ago. I wish I could tell you I marched to the hospital and demanded an audience with anyone wearing a suit. I didn't. Hospitals are built to outlast you in a fight. Instead, I did something smaller, and, if I'm honest, more human. I googled Jameson in the name of our town. It turns out paper isn't the only thing that confesses, websites do too. Jameson's books, I read, Independent, on Main, near Elm. My breath snagged halfway between a laugh and a sob. I had passed that storefront plenty of times, noticing only that the sign was a deep, handsome green, and the display changed often enough to suggest care. I closed the laptop and did not go. Not that day. Shock and curiosity have different speeds. Shock sits you down and asks you to sip water. Curiosity finds your shoes and ties them without asking. That night, I took out one of the spiral notebooks and wrote on the first page of the second book strategy, not grief, not story, strategy. Under it, a list began to assemble itself in my handwriting. Check the deed, still in my name? Answer, yes. Mortgage status? Current, but the refinance Olivia had hinted at was impossible without me. Ethan employment? He'd left his job 6 months back to recalibrate. Olivia business? An Instagram gloss with inconsistent California sun captions for a Midwestern life. An LLC registered last year. A website that looked studio rented. Reviews that read like cousins wrote them after a wine flight. None of this was spite, it was context. People make choices inside whatever stories they believe about themselves. I needed to know which story Olivia believed so I would stop letting it define me. The next morning I pulled real records. Public information is the quiet friend who shows up when everyone else is loud. County property site. The deed glowed back at me with my name on it. The Secretary of State's business search delivered a polite page for Olivia Ascends LLC, member managed, 1 member, late on filings. The Better Business Bureau had what the Triple B always has, complaints written in the key of exhaustion. I printed everything and started a file. Then I took a shower hot enough to scrape off a layer of the last 10 years. I kept expecting grief to interrupt me mid-task. It didn't. Instead, a different feeling set up camp: competence. The world had made a habit of letting me prove I could survive with less. Now I would prove I could choose with more. On the 3rd day after the attic, I put on the wool coat again, stuffed the envelope with Ruth's letter into my tote, and walked to Main Street like it was both a pilgrimage and a dare. The bookstore looked the way bookstores look in movies that want you to forgive them for being comforting. Planters out front with begonias still pretending it wasn't October. A chalkboard sign with a hand-lettered quote about reading that made you roll your eyes and smile anyway. Inside I could see the warm color of actual wood shelves. A bell pinged when the door opened for a customer. I didn't go in. Instead, I sat on a bench across the street and watched through the glass. A man, 30, maybe 32, spoke to a customer with the attention of someone who doesn't make people repeat themselves. He wore simple clothes, clean and unremarkable, the way a person might dress when he values readability over spectacle. He moved with an economy I recognized. He smiled with a softness I felt in my bones. My throat tightened, not because I knew, but because something in me that had been off-key for years suddenly found the right note and held it. I cried. Not the dramatic kind that asks for witnesses, the kind you can hide under a collar and a turned-down head. Then I wiped my face with the cuff of my coat and did something I'm proud of: nothing. I let the moment be exactly what it was: information, not instruction. Back home, I opened the strategy notebook and added new lines. Meet attorney. I knew a woman from church who had left law to raise twins and then returned with sharper elbows. She answered my email within an hour: tomorrow, 10 a.m., Courthouse Cafe. Bring deed, any documents, and your spine. I'll bring the law. I slept that night for the first time since leaving. I won't romanticize it. The mattress springs protested like an old choir, and the radiator hissed whenever the wind took offense. But I slept, because the person I had been, giver, pleaser, the one who made a home and then accepted exile within it, had been thanked for her service and invited to sit down. The person who stood up in her place was unfamiliar but welcome, a woman who didn't need to be cruel to be done. In the morning, I took my coffee with honey and watched the light push itself down the hallway of the apartment, as if it had to convince each board to shine. I was not free yet. Freedom is more than an unlocked door, it's the belief you have somewhere to walk. But I had a letter from a woman who loved me enough to risk my anger, in order to give me truth. I had a file that turned a decade of gaslit fog into a map. I had a face in a bookstore window I did not yet have the right to claim, and the discipline not to claim it. I had a name on a deed and the intention to act like it. And I had something else too, something I had missed until it arrived again. The sound of my own mind thinking in full sentences, unafraid of where they might end. If you want, say continue, and I'll deliver parts 3-5. The Green Sign Bookshop, 2 doors, Ethan and Michael, and the next chapter key, at the same 1,000+ word depth in this voice. Main Street has a way of hiding its best stories in plain sight. Coffee shops that pretend to be vintage but are really just expensive. Dry cleaners run by couples who have memorized half the town's stains. The used car lot where the balloons are always half deflated. I'd walked past the corner of Main and Elm more times than I could count, never stopping long enough to wonder what life existed behind the painted glass storefront with the green sign, Jameson's Books. After Ruth's letter, that sign burned into me like it had been waiting. One Saturday morning, leaves scraping down the sidewalks like restless coins, I finally stood across the street and let myself look. Through the wide windows I saw him. I didn't need confirmation, not really, just the rhythm of his body moving told me what I already knew. Michael, the boy who should have been mine, the man who was. He wore a simple gray sweater with the sleeves pushed up. His hands moved easily across stacks of paperbacks, arranging them with the kind of care that says books are more than merchandise. He leaned down to help a young woman find a poetry collection, nodding with that patient softness people develop when they actually listen. I sat on the bench across the street, clutching a paper cup of coffee I didn't taste. My heart beat so hard it pressed against my coat, as if begging to be let out. I had rehearsed all kinds of scenarios: anger, confrontation, wild weeping, but none of them prepared me for the ordinary truth of his existence. He laughed gently at something the customer said, his voice carrying through the glass. It wasn't a thunderclap revelation, it was worse. It was recognition, so simple and devastating I could barely breathe. I didn't go inside, not that day, or the next. Instead, I made a ritual of it. Each morning after errands or after scribbling in my strategy notebook, I walked to Main, bought coffee from the cart by the corner, and sat across from the bookshop pretending to scroll my phone. I watched the rhythms, the UPS deliveries around 10, the students who lingered near the graphic novels, the older man who came every Thursday for the chess club in the back. Michael belonged there, not in the dramatic way of destiny, but in the steady way of someone who had always been rooted. Meanwhile, Ethan and Olivia's world was beginning to show its cracks. Olivia's Instagram posts became more desperate, grainy motivational quotes, endless shots of lattes captioned "Rise and Thrive." Her so-called business, Olivia Ascends, was all smoke. A rented studio space, fake testimonials, credit cards maxed out to keep the image polished. Ethan had quit his job months earlier to manifest his next chapter, which sounded a lot like freeloading when I dug into the paperwork. I knew this because I checked county records, business filings, even Yelp reviews. I built a second notebook, not for grief but for evidence. Receipts, timelines, cross-referenced notes. Every page whispered back to me, "You're not weak, you're observant." I hired a lawyer, a woman about my age, sharp eyes, sharper pen. We met in the courthouse cafe, over bitter coffee that tasted like resolve. I handed her the deed, my file of documents, and told her I wanted my house back, not to live in, it wasn't home anymore, but because it was mine. She looked me over and said, "We'll file this week." No judgment, no pity, just the cool efficiency of someone who knew the law would back me. I signed the papers without shaking. For once, the lines on a form didn't mean I was sacrificing, they meant I was reclaiming. That night, I walked past the old house. The porch light glowed. Olivia sat on the swing with a glass of wine, scrolling on her phone. Ethan was inside, controller in hand, absorbed in some game. They looked comfortable, as though life were fixed and endless, but beneath them, the ground was shifting, and they had no idea I had already loosened the foundation. The next day, I crossed the street. I opened the door to Jameson's Books, the bell announcing me into air that smelled of dust and stories. Michael looked up. "Back again," he said, smiling like I was already a regular. "I bought a novel I didn't need." He rang it up himself, bagging it carefully. "Good choice," he said. "Hard to find these days." His voice was warm, familiar in a way that nearly undid me. "Do you own this place?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "Sort of," he said. "My parents helped me start it. They're retired now, so I keep it running." Of course they did. Parents who supported him, who gave him a launch pad. Not like Ethan, who had me, and still laughed at my expense. The irony stung. But underneath the sting was something stranger, hope. Because kindness lived in this man like marrow, and I wanted to know if maybe, just maybe, that had something to do with me. I walked home slowly, the bag crinkling in my hand. That night, I wrote in both notebooks. In the first, my feelings, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the recognition that throbbed like a bruise. In the second, the facts: my lawyer had filed the motion. Olivia's LLC taxes were overdue. Ethan hadn't made a single payment on the house in months. I wasn't just grieving anymore. I was building. And for the first time in years, I felt like the architect of something that belonged only to me. Part 4, Two Doors. Ethan and Michael. Ethan showed up at my apartment on a Tuesday afternoon. I saw his outline through the peephole before he knocked. His hair was messy, his face drawn tight with the panic of someone who discovered bills don't manifest themselves into being paid. He knocked once, then again. "Mom," he said through the door, his voice frayed. "Please don't do this." I didn't open it. For years I had stood on the other side of doors while laughter carried on without me. Now he could taste it, the loneliness of being ignored in the place you thought was safe. When I finally let him in days later, his first words were an accusation. "Why are you doing this to us?" I almost laughed. Us. As if there had been an us in years. I sat calmly across from him. "I'm not doing anything to you, Ethan. I'm doing something for me." His jaw clenched. "You're selling the house." "My house?" "No," I corrected, my voice level. "The house I bought. The house I paid for. You let your wife turn me into your maid and you laughed." He looked at the floor, shoulders sagging. "I thought you were being dramatic. I didn't know it hurt you like that." "That's the problem," I said. "You never wanted to know." He flinched. "Olivia's not who I thought she was." "That's not news to me." His eyes were glassy. "I lost everything." "No," I said. "You gave it away." The silence stretched until I stood and pulled an envelope from the drawer. Ruth's letter, the DNA report, the hospital documents. I handed it to him. "Read this." He skimmed, his face draining. This can't be real." "It is," I said. "You're saying I'm not your son?" "I'm saying you weren't born to me, but I raised you as if you were. Every meal, every sacrifice. You had all of me, even when you didn't want it." His voice broke. "So who is your real son?" I didn't answer. He sat there, the pages trembling in his hands, the boy I had raised unraveling in front of me. "I don't know who I am anymore," he whispered. "Now you know how I felt," I said. Tears came, not the kind that invite sympathy, but the kind that collapse walls. For the first time he looked smaller than the anger I had carried. I walked him to the door. "Can we fix this?" he asked, his voice cracking. "I don't know," I said. "But it's not my job to try anymore." I closed the door quietly, the sound final without being cruel. 2 days later I sat in the break room of the bookstore with Michael. The tiny space smelled like peppermint tea and old paper. I set the envelope on the table. "I've been coming here for a reason," I began. He studied me, cautious but kind. "I figured. You're not exactly here for the books." I gave a sad laugh. "No, I'm not." I pushed the envelope toward him. "This is going to change everything." He opened it, brows knitting as he read Ruth's letter, the hospital records, the DNA summary. His hands trembled just slightly. When he finished, he didn't look at me. He kept his eyes on the papers, as though if he lifted them the truth might spill out. "This is a lot," he said finally. "I know, and you're Margaret?" "Yes." He looked at me then, his eyes shining. "I don't feel anything. Not yet." "You don't have to," I said. "I'm not here to ask for a place in your life. I just wanted you to know. I needed you to know." He nodded slowly. "Why now?" "Because silence weighs more than truth, and I couldn't carry it anymore." He exhaled. "I have parents. They raised me well." "I know," I said softly. "I would never ask you not to love them." We sat in silence, the kind that doesn't punish but steadies. Finally he asked, "Can we take it slow? I don't want to make this something it's not." "I wouldn't ask for anything else." He gave a small, fragile smile. "You want to stay for tea?" I smiled back. "I'd love to." That afternoon we didn't talk about DNA or fate or lost decades. We talked about rain, about the absurdity of wind chimes, about favorite books, and in that quiet, something began. Not a new family, not yet. but the start of a truth shared by two people who had been strangers and didn't need to be anymore. Freedom is a word people throw around too easily. Politicians use it to sell promises, brands slap it on t-shirts, even motivational speakers wave it like a banner at conferences where the coffee tastes like cardboard. For years I thought freedom was too big for someone like me, too loud, too expensive. But one morning, when I turned the key at the front door of Michael's bookstore, I realized freedom wasn't fireworks. It was the sound of a lock clicking open to a room where I finally belonged. It started with a phone call the night before. Michael's voice had been casual, almost playful. "I want to show you something tomorrow," he said. There was a weight under his tone though, the kind you can't disguise even when you try. The next morning, the air had the crisp edge of late November. I walked down Main Street with my scarf pulled high, past holiday decorations already half lit on lampposts, the kind of cheer that looks better from a distance. When I pushed open the door to the bookstore, the bell chimed, and there he was, standing by the back wall where an arched doorway had been framed with fresh wood. Above it hung a brand new sign, hand-painted, the letters brushed in soft gold, "The Next Chapter." I froze. "What's this?" He stepped forward and handed me a brass key. It was small, polished, warm from his palm. "It's a new section I'm opening," he said. "A cozy reading space, a coffee corner, maybe community talks. I want it to feel like more than a store, like belonging." I turned the key over in my hand. "And you want me to open it?" He looked at me then, eyes steady. "I want you to have it." My throat tightened. "Michael, you don't have to." "I know," he said, his voice soft, "but I want to. You gave someone your whole life, and they treated you like furniture, like background noise. But I see you. I don't need you to prove anything. You've already done enough." Tears welled, and I blinked hard. Gratitude has a way of undoing you more than cruelty ever could. I walked to the doorway, slid the key into the lock, and turned. It clicked smoothly. The door swung open and warm light spilled out. Inside, sunlight filtered through tall windows onto half-stocked shelves. A rug lay in the center, soft underfoot. A worn armchair waited beside a small table set with a porcelain teapot. The air smelled of new wood and old paper, a blend of beginnings and history. I stood there, undone. "Michael," he smiled, "consider it yours. For however long you want it." I stepped into the room, my hand brushing the spines of books already waiting for their readers. For a moment I closed my eyes and breathed it in. This wasn't just a bookstore corner. It was a room built from recognition, from the quiet decision to honor someone who had been invisible too long. That night, back in my apartment, I sat with one of my old notebooks, the last one, its final page blank. I wrote carefully, my hands steady. I was a woman who gave until I disappeared. Then I became the woman who took it all back. Not with rage, not with fire, but with silence, with truth, with a kind of strength they never saw coming. The next day, I signed the last of the papers with my lawyer. The house was sold, the profits mine. I wired a portion straight to a foundation that supports women starting over, those discarded, underestimated, silenced like I had been. They called to thank me, but I didn't need thanks. Every time I stepped into that bookstore room, every time I turned that brass key, I remembered I had finally written myself back into the story. Meanwhile, Ethan and Olivia unraveled. They moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of town. Olivia's parents withdrew their support after the file I'd sent them revealed her fake business practices. Her Instagram went quiet, her sponsorships gone. Ethan scrambled for work but found only rejection. Resumes don't gloss over years of entitlement. I didn't celebrate their collapse. It wasn't about revenge. It was about balance. For years I'd lived in a house that wasn't a home, mocked by people who fed off my generosity. Now they knew what it meant to feel powerless. Ethan reached out one last time. A text, "Can we meet?" Just once. Something in the tone felt different, stripped of entitlement. We met at a run-down park on the edge of town, the kind of neutral place where no memories could interfere. He sat hunched on a bench, hands clasped. He didn't ask for money or forgiveness. He asked for understanding. "I spent weeks trying to figure out what I was if I wasn't your son," he said. "And I realized I was still the boy you raised. I just never gave that back to you." I listened. For the first time in years, his words didn't sound like excuses. They sounded like recognition. "I don't hate you, Ethan," I said, "but I finally love myself more than I love the idea of you." He bowed his head, eyes wet. "I hope he's good to you, Michael." "He is," I said softly. "When we parted, I didn't promise reconciliation. I didn't promise anything. Some doors are meant to close gently, not slam, but close all the same." Back at the bookstore, Michael and I sat in the new room drinking tea. We didn't speak of DNA or fate or the decades we lost. We spoke about books, about weather, about ordinary things. And yet, under the surface, something new hummed, a bond that wasn't obligation, wasn't demand, just choice. I realized then that freedom isn't about erasing the past. It's about refusing to let it dictate your present. It's about finally choosing yourself without apology. The brass key sits in my palm even now as I write these words. It doesn't just open a door in a bookstore, it opens mine.